It gives me great pleasure this evening to be able to welcome Dr. Alexander Meyer to give us a talk about the writing tablets. And I have a little bit of an introduction to give you about Alex. Alexander Meyer is an associate professor of classical studies at the University of Western Ontario. He has published books and articles about the evolution of Roman auxiliary units, ancient timekeeping devices, and excavations at Vindolanda itself, where he's been involved in excavations since 2002. His specialties are Latin epigraphy, mobility in the ancient world, and the concepts of time and space. And he's been working with us within our writing tablet research committee for a number of years now. And so it's quite fitting that we've asked him to come and talk to us about frontiers of Roman writing. So without further ado, I'm very excited to be able to hand over to Alex and let him talk to us about the tablets. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be here, wherever here is for everybody. Before I really get started, though, I would like to indulge in a Canadian tradition. Well, it's what's becoming a Canadian tradition, which is a brief land acknowledgement. So I am here in my office at the University of Western Ontario, which is in London, Ontario. And it is traditional here for us to start by acknowledging that the University of Western Ontario occupies land that traditionally belonged to the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Chinantan First Nations. And that we recognize that they are contemporary stewards of the land, but also that this land is subject to the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant. I think that this is particularly meaningful for us to acknowledge these things as we think about the Roman world and, of course, the Roman tradition of imperialism and our own, imperialist backgrounds. And that's going to be an interesting thing to think about during our lecture today, and then also sort of going forward as you reflect upon what we talk about today, because one of the things that I'm going to talk a fair amount about today is slavery. This is not a happy subject, of course, but one that I've become interested in recently, especially as it has to do with Vindolanda. So we could think about the ways that these people interact. And also I'd like you to think, and I'm going to challenge you a few times as we go through this, to think about how we view Roman stuff. We are, of course, we wouldn't be here if we weren't interested in these things. But we have a tendency, I think, to romanticize life in the Roman Empire, and especially at Vindolanda. I'm afraid I'm going to disabuse you of a few of those things today. But it's important to recognize that there's this long tradition in the world. So that's it. Now, today, as I'm talking to you, I want to do three things. And it's going to be hard to do this in an hour, but I'm going to give it a shot. The first is that I would like to have a sort of brief celebration of the fact that we are almost exactly 50 years from the first discovery of writing tablets at Vindolanda. And I just want to give you a brief history of the site and also of the discovery of the tablets and what research has been done on the tablets since they were discovered 50 years ago. I'd then like to introduce you to a few of the tablets that you might not have seen. So these are some of the more recently published tablets, all of which have something to do with slavery, at least in my mind, and therefore are sort of thematically connected, but have some interesting points about the history and future of tablet research as well. And then to talk to you about the research in the tablets that is ongoing now and will continue in the future. So hopefully we'll have time to do all three of those things. I feel obligated at the beginning of any talk about Vindolanda to show these things. I think that you are probably all pretty familiar with this. This is the line, of course, of Hadrian's Wall and the Stangate Frontier and Vindolanda right here in the middle. And I hope you can see my pointer. Otherwise, it's the one that's written white on green. And of course, the site of Vindolanda itself is lovely. Aerial photograph taken, I think this was last year, but a very recent one that Andy Burley was kind enough to share with me, just to remind you exactly what we're dealing with. And some of the places that we're going to talk about today, the bonfire site, which is just down in this area, and then later excavations up in this area up here as well, though I'm not going to get too much into the details of the archaeology. And here's just a plan also of the site, if this is easier for you to comprehend and refer back to at some point in the future. and a traditional, and just some of the phasing of the fort. So whereas we're talking about writing tablets, we're really talking about the first 4 or 5 periods of occupation at Vindolanda. And just as a brief review, we get period 1 there. We don't even need those circles. Period 2, period 3, and then period 4 here. Right now, the history of Vindolanda, at least the modern history of Vindolanda, really began in 1702. So we're going to go back that far and talk about this. And the first time that Vindolanda appears in sort of modern historical record was in that year in a letter from Christopher Hunter. Right. This is undoubtedly talking about the 3rd century bathhouse on the site. I'm sure that most of you know exactly where that is. Otherwise, we can go back. I'm going to show you exactly where that is. Right. So talking about this area up here. Now, these were not any systematic excavations, but rather sort of an exploration. And I like to picture these sort of late Baroque Indiana Joneses going out into the hinterland to explore to see what they can find. But excavations, however primitive they may have been, or unscientific, perhaps I should say, rather than primitive, began 13 years after that. So in 1715, John Warburton was on the site digging away and found leather shoes and an altar. So it's probably around the bathhouse, again, being the most obvious feature on the site, and perhaps in a section of Fort Ditch, explaining some of the organic materials that he found there. This means, of course, as far as we're concerned, that active investigation of Vindolanda began 208 years ago. So we have an incredible history on this site, and of course, an incredible site to go with it. The next work, however, wasn't undertaken until the Reverend Anthony Headley and his wife, Margaret Barrow, acquired a bunch of the land around Vindolanda, starting with Crindledykes and Little Chester's Croft in 1814, then Codley Gate, which is now the little rental property and the at-cost storage for the museum, in 1818, and completed construction on Chesterholm, where the museum now is, in 1831. And Anthony Headley, in particular, undertook small excavations, most notably in 1832, when he, or perhaps rather we should say his workmen, discovered a shield boss, a spearhead, and over 300 coins near the west gate of the 3rd century stone fort. So talking about in this area, someplace over here. Now, interestingly, we went back a number of years ago to clear out this area and expose it and excavate it systematically. We found more hundreds of coins. There were just an incredible number of coins in that area, which gets into our archaeology and, of course, our understanding of that area as well. He also uncovered the east and the north gates, so really started to expose the site, and found leather shoes, which he says northwest of the stone gate, or the Stane Gate, which is probably not the field that we refer to as the North Field, but someplace out there, like across-ish from the West Gate building. But that field that is now the North Field was owned by somebody else at that time. And he continued small excavations whenever he could, sort of off-season for the farmers, but nothing too extensive as near as we can tell. His estate then lasted until it was sold to John Clayton in 1863. And I'm sure this is a name that many of you have heard. We talk about the Clayton estate a fair amount, especially around Chester's. The Clayton estate owned, as you probably know, a whole bunch of property along the central sector of Wall, really from Magna East, as far as Chester's. And he didn't undertake any great sort of systematic work at Vindolanda, but the site was part of the Clayton estate when the Brigamoglos altar was found, if you know that one, and the Vindolandenses altar. And the site it remained in the control of the Clayton estate then until 1929, when it was sold to Eric Burley. There are great stories about the ins and outs of how Eric ended up with Vindolanda, but we don't really have time to go into those today. But Eric started excavations then in 1929 and went into the 30s. And he exposed the gates once more that Headley had already been into. He was the first one to encounter the roundhouses that we still haven't quite sorted out, but we're still working on. He glimpsed the pre-Hadrianic material in the ditches, though didn't do any great exploration of it, and really focused his attention rather on the Principia and the Praetorium and the headquarters building. He was then, of course, his archaeological work interrupted and ultimately sort of terminated by World War II, excuse me, and taking up a job at Durham University. He found it basically impossible to commute between the two places and get any archaeology done. And he ultimately sold Codley Gate and the Fort Plateau in 1950. This was not, however, before Robin Burley first got his hands on the site, and he went in to do his first excavation under Eric's supervision in 1949. We might think about this as a great turning point in the site, and when one of our most important, what should we say, forerunners, I suppose, influences for sure, became really involved in the archaeology. And Robin then returned in 1959 and explored a road section and a metal workshop just southwest of the stone fort. And if you could picture where that is also where the bonfire site is. So he was just above the bonfire site. Somehow, I mean, he was incredible. If any of you knew him, you will know this, but he just had a nose for this stuff. He knew exactly where to go. He just, in this case, didn't go deep enough. But, in 2 dimensions, he had the perfect spot. Robin then returned in 1967, 68, and 69 with permission from the then landowner Thomas Harding to excavate more on the site. And in 1970, Robin and Patricia's dream of owning this site, or at least having control of the site and it being independent, came to fruition thanks to Daphne Archibald, who bought the site and donated it then immediately to the newly formed Vindolanda Trust in the spring of 1970. This allowed then for prolonged excavations and systematic excavations of the site, which we are still enjoying today. And Robin started out excavating in 1970 and 71. I believe that Patricia was out there as well, excavating around the 3rd century bathhouse. In the spring, well, actually, we should say probably in the summer of 1972, that excavation was very, very wet. And Robin took a small amount of the team down to that southwest corner of the stone fort and started excavating out some areas so that he could improve the drainage of the site. He did some of that work and then quit for the winter and came back in March of 1973, right to that same spot, 50 years ago, practically to the day today. And it was on that location that he found the first of the writing tablets at Vindolanda. And I think it's worth, in honor of this great anniversary, just to read a little bit of what Robin has written about this. This is in 1977, so just 4 years after that first discovery was made. Robin wrote, in the middle of March of 1973, the 3 permanent staff had devoted some time to removing the infill from the previous autumn's drainage trench and bottoming the deposit. There was a great deal of wood amongst the straw and bracken, ranging from oak beams and planking to wattle fencing and twigs. While troweling this deposit, I came across 2 small thin fragments of wood, which looked rather like oily plane shavings. I wondered if this was evidence for woodworking on the spot and passed one fragment up to my assistant on the surface for his opinion. He examined the wood and passed it back to me, observing that it seemed to have some peculiar marks on it. I had another look and thought I must have been dreaming, for the marks appeared to be ink writing. He took the piece over to the excavation hut, or we took the piece over to the excavation hut and gently cleaned it, discovering that there were in fact 2 slivers of wood adhering to each other. After gently prizing them apart with a knife, the knife, we didn't know better at the time. Yeah, the knife. He stared at the tiny we stared at the tiny writing in utter disbelief. I can only imagine what an exciting moment that must have been. Absolutely incredible. And it has led to all sorts of amazing discoveries over the subsequent 50 years. Now, it's interesting to note with this as well, that excavation that Robin was doing was 13 feet below the ground level at the time and 9 feet below the water table. An absolutely incredible and brave excavation that he was doing, and really sort of wonderful. It's just like excavation bravery, like what a thing to commit to. Now, the day after this, Robin, Patricia, and Eric Burley all hopped in the car with a tub full of writing tablet and went to Durham University to show what they had discovered to Richard Wright, and found at the end, when they got to Richard, that the entire tablet was dark and the ink was gone. And he suggested that they try some photography and directed them to Alison Rutherford, who was at that time working like an expert photographer working at the medical school at the Newcastle University. And she used infrared photography and other methods to recover the text that had disappeared from the visible spectrum. And we owe a great deal, of course, to her work, which continued for a long time on the site as well, and doing this photography. Now, Robin's discovery, or the team's discovery, the trust's discovery 50 years ago was a sensation, of course. And all the more remarkable because only one tablet with ink writing on it had been discovered in Britain before 1973. And that was, interestingly, a stylus tablet, of which I just show you a picture there, that actually still, rather than just being written in the wax, and maybe us getting some scratches through it, had actually been written on with ink as well. Now, this is a very interesting tablet. It seems to be some sort of bill of sale. It was found in Stoke, or Chewstoke, actually, in Somerset in April of 1954. It seems to be a bill of sale that actually has similarities with a document that we have found at Vindolanda but not yet published. This is, by the way, in case you're wondering, just a shameless plug for future research that's going to come out about the site. I can't talk about it today, but it's very, very cool. So be aware, things are happening behind the scenes, even as we speak. In the next couple of years, 1973, 74, and 75, over 200 tablets were discovered on the site. But really good images weren't really available to everybody until 1979. And this had a lot to do with the difficulties in conserving an entirely new type of artifact, which in that development work for the conservation process was done by the British Museum and Patricia Burley. And Patricia did most of maybe all of the curation of that, of those tablets for a long time until Barbara took over, which seems like a few years ago to me, but it's probably many years ago now. And then we could start getting readings from writing tablets. This is, of course, one that I'm sure that everybody here is pretty familiar with. This is tablet 345, I think it is. Right, which says, I've sent to you pairs of socks from Satua, 2 pairs of sandals, and 2 pairs of underpants, right? This was the first tablet found. And of course, one that we always return to because it is interesting and humorous and entirely unique in the Roman world. Now, once these images were really available, work could start on deciphering the texts of the stylus tablets and drawing out as much knowledge as we could from them. And that work was really spearheaded, let's say, by Anthony and Robin Burley, and then ultimately published with great influence from them by Alan Bowman and David Thomas in 1983. And that was the first volume of the Vindolanda Writing Tablets, which included 48 of the tablets from 1973 to 1975, substantial texts, and then fragmentary texts and notes, about 22 more tablets. It was accompanied by a volume published about the same time by Alan Bowman, sort of synthesizing this material, and is one that is still certainly worth reading today. And I think it may be in a bibliography that I'll show you at the end, but I can always share that information if you want it. Now, interestingly, with this, the first volume of the Vindolanda tablets, and I don't think I have my copy here, but it is unnumbered. And yet, in subsequent years, we now have volume 2, volume 3, and 3 articles that serve as the first 3 parts of volume 4. But we have to remember that in these early years, there was really no guarantee that we were ever going to find more writing tablets. And yet they certainly have come up in excavations. In 1985, the excavations were taken up by the southwest corner of the Stone Fort, of Stone Fort 2 again, and continued the excavation. Something like 340 catalog numbers of stylus tablets came out of that excavation, including the birthday party invitation, one of the big intelligence reports, and what we call intelligence report that records the Bertunculi on it. So an incredibly important excavation there. And these were then published in 1986. So that work continued on, and you would have thought that we would be done at that volume, but even by the time the 1994 volume came out, new tablets had already been discovered and then made their way into VinTab 3. And that included many of the writing tablets that came from the so-called bonfire site, which was excavated in 1993. So right at the same time that VinTab 2 was being prepared for publication. There was this great hoard. I'm sure many of you know exactly where this site is, but if you can imagine the stone fort up in this area, going on the sort of top of our map, the bonfire site or sites are right down here. Earlier periods, of course, than the stone fort. Here, I think it's worth, again, returning to the excitement that Robin certainly felt in these excavations. So here is a bit of a letter that he wrote to Alan Bowman and David Thomas, and they've recorded in their volume, describing the excavation of the bonfire site. It says, the excavator had reached the heart of the bonfire site to discover a mass of tablet fragments, congealed in a mixture of ash, soot, bone fragments, and pottery. Every small lump of material contained many fragments, and in it was impossible to separate them into different categories. In some cases, the weight of stones and other material above the tablets had caused them to fracture into numerous pieces, and with store lists or accounts written on both sides of the wood, it has been almost impossible to join them together correctly. Now, we should all be so lucky as to participate in an excavation where there are just too many tablets to deal with. It must have been absolutely incredible. But we can only live in hope. Unfortunately, the next few years of excavations should be pretty good for this kind of thing. And there's no reason to believe that we won't find something like that. Even in last year's excavations, which weren't particularly conducive to finding stylus tablets, there were 9 new ink tablets discovered and 3 new stylus tablets. But there is still a great deal to do in the research of all of these tablets, and of course, many, many tablets to talk about. So that is more or less the end of the history of writing tablets as far as I'm concerned. So I want to move on and talk a little bit about a few writing tablets in particular and why I think they're interesting, which hopefully give you an idea of the potential research that can be done on these tablets beyond just the decipherment of them. I mean, deciphering them is, of course, entirely crucial and a very difficult and mysterious job. But the tablets have implications of their own as well that go far beyond the site and beyond the text itself. And then talk a little bit more about, again, the work that is going on currently into the writing tablets, excuse me. Right. So the tablets are certainly important. We see them in scholarship cited all of the time, especially those really famous tablets that have very obvious implications about military history. So we might think about the personnel reports that we get from the site, gender and sexuality studies. So really thinking about like the material that we get from the archive of Lepidina. The ancient economy has a lot to do with some of the correspondence that we get on the site, but also lists of supplies in various ways. And of course, literacy. Like just the fact that people are writing up on the frontier is a very interesting thing, and can tell us, or tells us maybe some really new information about how writing was used and who exactly could write. There are a lot of ways in which the tablets also sort of demand further discussion. And I'm going to pick 3 tablets to talk about today. And I really want to talk about these in the hopes of highlighting for you the broad implications that tablets have about life at Vindolanda, but also about the Roman Empire as a whole. Broadly speaking, people are pretty aware of the papyri that have come out of Egypt over the last 150 years. And until, let's say 20 years ago or something, people really assumed that the Egyptian material was exceptional, right? They said that, well, yeah, we get this like really cool stuff from Egypt, but Egypt was an imperial possession. It wasn't actually like a province in the traditional sense, and it had this long history that involved ancient Egypt and then Ptolemaic Egypt and Hellenistic Egypt, and and coming into the Roman period, and therefore it's very different. Over the last 20 or 30 years, though, people have started to recognize, as we get more material from outside of Egypt, that actually the Egyptian stuff has a lot in common with material that we find elsewhere in the empire, and including stuff really that we find at Vindolanda. And the same discussion is kind of going on with Vindolanda. This is not to say that Vindolanda isn't a unique archaeological site. It absolutely is. It's incredible. But the material that we get, while remarkable in its preservation, we have to think about it as being also mostly representative of what's happening around the empire. Right? So we're not getting things at Vindolanda that didn't once exist in other places. At least that's my belief about this stuff. It is very cool. But if you look at similar material that has come out of places in continental Europe and Carlisle and London and stuff, we get a lot of overlap with that, which allows us then to use the Vindolanda material as a proxy for much larger themes. I want to see some of that, especially, as I say, in relation to slavery, with just looking at a few tablets. So one of these is tab Vindol 855, which I've labeled here as a literary text, which is me kind of hedging my bets a little bit. This is a really interesting one, though. So it was discovered, and I've given you a translation down there on the bottom. This is Bowman and Thomas's translation, which is not universally accepted. It's actually a reaction to another couple of translations by Tony Burley and an Italian scholar named Scapaticcio, who both have written really interesting things about this tablet as well. But I'm just going to give you this one because I like it, and I think it raises an interesting point. So this tablet was found in 2002, my first year of excavation. I don't remember finding it, but maybe I did. Maybe you can't say I didn't. In a period 2-3 context beneath the Severan commander's residence. If you can picture where that is on our map, I sort of circled it a little bit right at the beginning. We're sort of returning to that area. Now, Scapaticcio recognized this passage as a muddled quotation from Virgil. That's interesting, right? Virgil is awesome. This would have been the fourth, would tip my hand a little bit there, right? It would be the fourth passage, I think, that we have of Virgil at Vindolanda. And it's incredible to think that people up in the frontiers were reading Virgil and writing Virgil and even thinking about Virgil. Now, it's a very traditional thing to use passages of Virgil to learn to write, for example. You know, it's like, if you need something to write, why not start with some Virgil? And that makes perfect sense, right? It's not enough to, I don't think, guarantee to us that anybody at Vindolanda was performing Virgil or reading Virgil, you know, in its whole. I mean, if we could find a page with, you know, lots of lines of Virgil, I would be more prone to believe that. But certainly the people are getting a classical education at Vindolanda in the traditional ways that we would expect somebody, and I'm going to pick this name at random, more or less, but not at random at all, Cicero, would have received an education in Rome. And this has interesting implications, but it has even more interesting implications if we accept Bowman and Thomas's translation of this line. So they say, just as Thebe deceived her innocent husband, right? Husband is thrown in here to continue this line of thinking. Their argument, though, is that this is actually a composition exercise written about Thebe, the wife of Alexander of Pherae, who is a Thessalian tyrant in the 4th century BC. And a typical and documented subject of oratorical exercises in Roman education. That doesn't seem maybe at first to be particularly interesting, except if we believe this, that means that there's somebody at Vindolanda who is not only learning to read and write by being recited some lines of Virgil, and there are ways in which, you know, having metrical lines would help you to write things a little bit easier as far as quantity of vowels is concerned and all sorts of technical things. But that is a very different thing than learning to compose words in Latin. This would mean that somebody's not only learning to write at the site, but also being trained in oratory and composition, which gets us really from the sort of basic education of literacy to someplace close to the heights of Roman education by thinking about more sophisticated ways of communication. Right? That is by thinking about oratory and forensic discourse and also like how to construct an argument. Right? So we get this idea then not only of literacy, but also perhaps of literariness at Vindolanda, which is really quite remarkable. We could even say then, and I chose Cicero earlier because this theme of Thebe is one that Cicero himself addresses a couple times in our corpus of Ciceronian literature, and is a pretty sophisticated theme. Now, the next step in thinking about this tablet is to think, who was this student and who was the teacher? These are largely unanswerable questions. Intuitively, we would probably say, well, maybe this is a child of Severus Carialis, right, who we know as the praetorian, the prefect in this period at Vindolanda in which this tablet was discovered, and he is being educated. Intuitively, that makes some sense, but we really have no evidence to support that. Now, who is the teacher also? We could say that the teacher was Carialis himself, or perhaps that he had on the site a tutor who was tutoring his children. And traditionally in the Roman world, that tutor would be very likely to have been a well-educated slave. Now, in a much broader thing, I mean, that's interesting to have somebody that well-educated kicking around and teaching all the way up in Britain. But there are also some interesting implications with this about Severus Carialis and his identity. Right, we always assume that he was a Batavian because he was the commander of Batavian troops, and we know that the Batavians were commanded by their own noblemen. But if he is involved in some way in this piece of education, we would have to believe that he was very well acquainted and somewhat enthusiastic about Roman literary culture and Roman education and, broadly speaking, Roman culture, which really gets to the question, how Batavian was he? And of course, this gets us thinking about this theme of slavery, which is certainly one that we are not comfortable with, but that we can't deny, and we have to continue thinking about at Vindolanda. So another tablet, and here, so in the previous tablet, we have some slave who we can't really see, but who is well educated and presumably respected in some way for his education, right, and brought to the frontiers for a reason, and employed to do something that we would consider skilled work. I have a sort of slightly different view of this, looking at this tablet. So this is tablet 890, which I call the wrong key. Other people call it other things, which is one of my favorite tablets from Vindolanda, because I have great sympathy for everybody involved in this story that unfolds in this tablet. So I'll just read this translation for you. It says, Julius Verecundus to Audax, greetings. As soon as it will have been possible, send in the morning part of the load which I have today dispatched to you, and that is to Vos. So more than one you, which might be a mistake or might be intentional. I tend to believe that it's intentional. With 2 loose horses. Lest it be damaged by the conveyance, and there's something missing where I've given you the ellipsis there, but lest it be damaged by the conveyance in which the greens will be brought. That is, the shoots both of cabbage and of turnip, and send them. Also, you sent another key with the box than you should have done, for this is said to be the key of the little storeroom. Right? Essentially, if this Latin is, or this English is sort of mimicking the Latin, but what he's saying here is, I've sent you some produce, send some of that on first thing in the morning. And then also, you sent me the wrong key with this box, send me the right key. It all seems like sort of, I mean, it's a sort of amusing story, right? We've all been there where, you know, if you have a shed, you get out to the shed and you have the wrong key for the shed, or, you know, you have the key to the wrong car, or generally speaking, you're over 40 and you just can't remember where anything is and you can never find a damn thing. And that's just the human condition. Within the subtext of this tablet, though, I think that there's a lot going on. One of the things that you don't see just looking at the English, but you certainly could go look at the Latin and see this, is that the verbs in here are imperatives. It says mise, send them to me, right? Usually in the Vindolanda tablets, we get these really sort of elaborately polite things, maybe not elaborately polite, but they'd say, when you have a moment, if you can be bothered, please do this for me. Or I ask with the greatest respect that you consider doing me this favor. But in this tablet, which is written from a master to a slave, it is very abrupt, right? It says, as soon as it, in this translation is maybe not the most colloquial, but as soon as it will have been possible. He says, as soon as you're able to do so, send this stuff, right? Which is a far cry from somebody being really polite. Also in this, he doesn't say, I think maybe there's been a mistake and you've sent me the wrong key. He said, you sent me the wrong key, send me the right key. And within this, what we're seeing is a little bit more of this interaction between a master and an enslaved person, right? That is, that this relationship is not one by any means of equals or necessarily even of civility, but very much one that shows different social statuses and legal statuses as well. And it's rare that in the ancient world that we get this view into sort of a daily interaction between a free and an enslaved person. So a very interesting one, and one that I think merits a great deal of discussion. But this is the way that I'm reading the tone of this tablet. And then the last tablet I want to talk about is this one, and I've hidden the number here, but Vintab 974, which we colloquially refer to as the Batavians tablet, just because it starts with the Latin of the Batavians. So easy. But the text of this one is partial and sort of hard to deal with. We don't actually know what this tablet is. Like, yeah, we have pieces of it, but we don't understand what the entire contents of the tablet were. Something about of the Batavians. My fellow citizen of the Belovaki, we've lost the name and a verb presumably in here somewhere. A slave called Veracundus, citizen at Amiens, and I have given permission and travel expenses, 35 something is or another's, and I have kept that slave 15 years. Right? Again, we don't have a great idea of what this is, but there are a few options about what it might be. It might be a document that is recording the manumission of this slave, Veracundus, that is granting his freedom. It may be just recording some sort of business transaction, right? That he sent the slave to gather something up and he sent this amount of money with him. We can't really tell. And then my pet theory, and this is just a pet theory, and I think that, yeah, one of my strengths and weaknesses as an academic may be an overactive imagination, but I think you can read in this also that this slave has been someplace, and this document is meant as sort of travel papers to say, I've sent this person and this is who he is, and I've given him money. In which case, I mean, in any of these cases, it has some really interesting implications about slavery. The manumission thing is really important. Right? There is always this possibility for a Roman slave to be, or Roman enslaved person to be manumitted, to be freed from their slavery. As near as we can tell, though, it is quite rare, but would be very interesting if it's happening up here at Vindolanda. Also, if this is happening in some sort of codified form that we can find elsewhere in the empire, if we're using the same types of legal documents. And significantly, this is actually a stylus tablet rather than an ink tablet. And we find the legal text on stylus tablets pretty frequently. So it's very interesting that it takes on that form. Right? But if we think about this as in regards to travel, it tells us some very less pleasant things about Roman slavery. It suggests that slaves could be identified, right? That somebody was likely to see Veracundus and say, that guy's a slave, and we need to figure out exactly what's going on. It also implies that it might be very likely that having found an enslaved person traveling and with a little bit of money, that the assumption would be made that this person was either a runaway or a thief, right? And they needed documentation to prove that they were doing something that they were supposed to be doing. This brings up also this very unpleasant business of marking slaves. So we know that some slaves in antiquity in the Roman world were branded or tattooed or disfigured in some way that would identify them then as enslaved people. And it also raises this sort of cloud of discomfort, I suppose, in that we know that the maintenance of clear physical, social, and legal distinctions between free and enslaved peoples was an issue very much for comment in this period at the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century. And we can think about this mostly as it appears in Latin literature. And when I think about this issue in Latin literature, I think mostly about Martial, Juvenal, and Apuleius. So if you haven't read those, you should, especially Martial. You got to find a good translation of Martial, though, because it's funny. It's good stuff. Apuleius is just always awesome. So in this one text, we can see the extent to which enslaved people could be trusted with responsibility and to the extent to which they were scrutinized, humiliated, and oppressed, if we will. The way that in the last document, you could speak to Audax, Veracuntus spoke to Audax, and the way that this individual would be treated, if my hypothesis about travel papers is correct, is really remarkable. And in this way, we might think about, let's use a modern term, think about the last tablet and this tablet as being sort of full of microaggression, right? Even if there is nothing overtly violent about them, they make assumptions that really demean an individual, right? And this is an interesting thing that something that I find very disturbing about Roman slavery is both the recognition of the humanity of the slaves, right, and the idea of manumission, and the dehumanization of them at the same time as slaves. That's a big theoretical issue, but something that is different between ancient slavery and European colonial slavery of 16th, 17th, 18th century. And all of this gives us a window into the variety of experiences that enslaved people had in the Roman world. I just wanted to read you a quick quote, which I don't think I put on a slide. Oh, I did, from Paige Dubois in her book in 2016. She said, slaves occupied a great spectrum of subordinate social positions in Greek and Roman society. The slaves of the wealthy, especially those involved in household duties, serving at banquets, teaching children, could live in relative comfort, and if they lived apart from their owner, could set up households in accordance with their fortunes, resembling often those of poor freed persons. Some Roman slaves amassed great wealth before they bought their freedom. At the other end of the scale were slave laborers in mills and mines who lived short, wretched lives, barely clothed and fed like animals by their distant masters. This is one of our dangers of thinking about Vindolanda is we're sort of getting down to everyday life, but still a lot of the stuff that we're seeing is at the top end of the social spectrum of the little society that we're able to examine here. And one of the things that we need to do with writing tablets is to really put them in their broader archaeological context. Even at Vindolanda, we can think about this. We have 2 fragments of shackles from Vindolanda and 5 possible neck collars, and a padlock that was found with one of these sets of shackles, which would lead you to believe that there were, of course, slaves, very poorly treated slaves at Vindolanda, as well as perhaps a teacher of literature and some people who could be trusted to travel on their own. We could also think most unpleasantly, and I'm about to show you some human remains. So if that's not something you want, you can minimize your screen or something. But Andrew Burley and Trudy Buck are about to publish an article about the body of a young girl that was found in excavations on the site, buried under the floor of a barrack block in the northwest part of the site. There are no signs of trauma on this body or anything, but the manner in which it is buried suggests that this might well have been a slave who died or was killed inside the fort, and then just buried in the back corner of a building in sort of a shallow grave, which would get us to like the worst possible treatment of an individual that you could manage to think of, I think. I mean, well, if we could think, well, it's terrible, is what I mean to say. And with this, we can think about the few slaves that we know from the writing tablets, but within the scholarship of the Roman military, there is reason to believe that there would have been scores, if not hundreds, of slaves at Vindolanda at any given time. Certainly, we know that by the 4th century, so I think it was a decree of Constantine, which is preserved in the Theodosian Code, that the Roman army started to pay for each soldier to have a slave. So we would have had as many enslaved people on the site as we had free soldiers kicking around. From much earlier arguments by Michael Speidel in 1989 in particular, that said that all cavalrymen had at least one slave, and that there were probably one slave for at least every 10 infantrymen. This is based on records that we have of people going out on campaign and who was bringing the baggage with them. So this would have been a very significant part of the population at Vindolanda, and something that we can get to at least just a little bit by looking at looking at writing tablets, including the stylus tablets. Now, I've tried to highlight a little bit what I think is the importance of making this link between the archaeology that we have and the style and the documents that we get from the site, especially on the writing tablets. And that is something that we're working with really hard at the Trust and out in the academic community. And I think it was about 5 years ago, to 2009, that the Trust, under the auspices of Dr. Andrew Burley, didn't write doctor there, brought together a group specifically tasked with expanding our investigations into and our knowledge of writing tablets. I just want to acknowledge all of those people, and then maybe show you a little bit of what my little nook of this world is contending with. So just names of people and an idea of exactly what they're doing. So Andrew Burley is, of course, I would say the world's leading expert on the archaeology of Vindolanda. So he is leading this group and providing his archaeological expertise to every aspect of it, and being very, very supportive of all of this. Barbara Burley, of course, who you heard from earlier, is the curator of the museum, with great expertise in all of these things as well, and providing access to us who we need, and commenting and knowing the things that we're forgetting to look at and all of that. Patricia, who has been involved in this process from the very beginning and has huge institutional knowledge about everything Vindolanda, and of course, always encouraging as well. We also have in the group Richard Hobbs, who works at the British Museum and is the curator of the Romano-British collection there. Let's see, yeah, senior curator of Romano-British and late Roman collections, right? Who has been wonderful about getting us access to most of the writing tablets that are stored at the British Museum and have been since 1981, I think. Professor Elizabeth Green, who is also an archaeologist working on the site and the head of the Archaeological Leather Project, who lends her expertise about the site and her years of experience. She also has been working at Vindolanda for about 20 years, so knows a lot about what's going on there. Ian Hayes and Pete Wilson, who are sort of externals, who are giving us a lot of context for things outside of Vindolanda itself. And then the team that's really dealing with writing stuff like kind of on the ground. So Alan Bowman and David Thomas, who have been producing texts of these writing tablets since the very beginning, are still working on them, along with Roger Tomlin, to produce texts of new ink tablets. I hope I'm going to see them in a couple of weeks. I hope that they are close to some new texts. We'll see, but the last ones they published came out in 2019. You can find those in Britannia if you'd like to look them up. Right, Anna Willey, who's at Nottingham University, who is working on writing materials in general on the site, thinking about where we find them and what that tells us about literacy, but also the way that these things are actually used. So how you use an ink tablet or a wax tablet, or how you use a pen, or what are the things that we think are styly are actually styly. So very much the practical part of this, and what implications that has on our understanding of the social dynamics of the fort, perhaps. So she and I are working together to try to get all the writing material into one map so we can see where everything came from and where things cluster, and what that can tell us about Vindolanda. And of course, everybody at the museum is very much involved in that project as well, especially Barbara. Carolyn Cartwright at the British Museum has been working on wood. One of the things that I'm very interested in is the difference between ink and stylus tablets. One of the things that we find there is that the material from which stylus tablets are made is imported, whereas the ink tablets are made with domestic woods. That seems to me, this ranges into an area of curiosity for me, not expertise, about what physical written objects actually means. The concept that I call paratext. I didn't invent that title. That is what we use in sort of book history circles. Right, why it is. I mentioned that we find legal texts on stylus tablets, and it seems like maybe there is some requirement for some legal text that they be written on styluses made of a particular type of wood. That wood is then imported and stylus tablets made of them. You can read a whole bunch about this in 2016 Bloomberg documents, Bloomberg tablets publication by Roger Tomlin, also on this list, which has a whole section about how these tablets were made from barrel staves that were imported. So very interesting topic. And Carolyn, yeah, doing really interesting stuff with that. And also doing analysis to try to figure out how the Romans were making ink. So it would be good to know that for sure. And then the last section of this group, which is really my sort of bailiwick, is that we are trying to produce texts of stylus tablets from this site. We have hundreds of stylus tablets from Vindolanda, but only 3 have been completely published. And another dozen or so have been mentioned in various publications with readings, but without critical editions. So we were working on finding ways, especially to be able to read those. Those are very hard to read. As I mentioned before, they are intended to have wax on the top, and you're supposed to write in the wax, but the wax is all gone. So we're trying just to read the scratches that went through the wax and into the wood on the back. It's a very rewarding job, but also a very time-consuming job. It's something we've been at for about 5 years working on. That gives you an idea, I think, of all of the research that is going on the site. I have hit my time limit. So if you guys have questions that I can answer for you, I would be very happy to do that. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you so much, Alex. That was excellent.
Welcome.
We do have a few questions that have come up in the chat. So, and if anybody else has other questions, please do go ahead and put those in the chat. I would like to start with the first one, is which I know is something that you'll be interested in talking about because it goes into some of your research.
Yeah.
But would the use of kind of AI technology help with being able to rejoin the tablets? I believe this is when you were talking about trying to put the puzzle pieces together from the bonfire site.
Yes, absolutely. So this is something that we've been interested in. This work has been sort of pioneered over the last 30 years or so. The actual putting together of pieces by papyrologists, right? Who, they get these papyri from Egypt or from I think mostly the ones from Pompeii and Herculaneum, that like, if you unroll them, they just crumble. And people have done that, and we have the crumbly bits, and they're like, I'm going to put them all into on a scanner, and I'm going to make a computer put them back together. So yes, that has great potential for all sorts of things. And actually, so Alan Bowman in particular has been talking about the use of computers in this process since at least the mid 90s, probably the early 90s. And this has always been a concern. Now, in academic circles, especially here in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, money is always the limiting factor on these things. But we are lucky enough that one of my collaborators, so Alex Mullen, works at the University of Nottingham, which it doesn't solve the money problem, but is one of the world's leaders on this sort of technology. So we're always looking for ways to use artificial intelligence to help us with things. Probably the greatest achievement that we could expect to get from AI in any of this is the separation of texts. So those wax tablets, they get written on, in the wax, and there's some scratching that goes through and stuff, and then somebody will wipe the wax and write on them again. And if they are really heavy-handed, you can get 2 texts that are overlapping right on one piece of wood, and that's incredibly hard to differentiate which is which. Because we're getting partial letters at the best of times. You get 2 partial letters, and you don't know which one goes with which word. It becomes really difficult. So we're hoping that that's really where artificial intelligence could be of the most immediate assistance to us.
Fabulous, thank you. The next question would be, let's see here. There was when you were talking about the kind of tone within the slavery tablets or tablets, somebody is asking if it could have been written by a younger person, such as children of officers or younger officers, so the inference of that kind of imposing upon them was more of a structure within that, or was it slavery? Do you understand what I'm saying yet?
I do. So Veracundus, who I believe is we know pretty well, at this point. So yeah, he's the dude. We also know that this is the person who owns the slave, right? That, of course, you know, I've known many people in my day, and doesn't preclude the fact that Veracruz may lack maturity in this way and may just have been irritated, right, in whatever he was doing. I mean, another thing that I forgot to mention is that in that he says, you know, it's two audox, audaki, but usually in letters that we find in Vindolanda, they'll say suo audaki, right? His own audox, meaning his friend audox. And in this case, that little pleasantry is left off, right? Which makes me feel bad that I don't write "Dear Student" in my emails to all my students all the time. But you know,
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, time constraints.
Would the auxiliaries have been assigned individual slaves as well, or is it just the legionaries?
Okay, so they would not have been assigned them. They would probably have found them in some place. This raises actually another, or maybe I should say we don't really know, but this is always the assumption, is that they're going to pick up a slave someplace along the way. A lot is a lot. Some a few records that we have show auxiliary soldiers who bring slaves with them, or at least grooms, right? Like people who are going to take care of their horse or take care of them with them from their home community. So they're actually, yeah, bringing like, you know, an enslaved person that they knew at home, right? Like already had legal possession of, with them. But I don't think that there's, I mean, I would love to know, but I don't think we have any evidence to illuminate how that, you know, how the two would come together.
Fabulous. Yeah.
Yeah.
Next question is, was the gum arabic or equivalent ingredients for the ink has it been imported?
I've always wondered what gum arabic is. I believe so. Yes, but yeah, I mean, the thing about ink is that you can make ink out of all sorts of stuff, right? So really what you need is, yeah, something sticky and then something black, and that'll basically do it. So I don't have a great idea about the gum arabic, which is, as you said, like always quoted as being one of the ingredients. And we get that from the ancient sources as well. There's a remarkable amount of discussion, especially in Pliny, about ink and how to make it and where to get it. Mostly where to get it for him, because he's not making his own ink, right? And then also like wax for wax tablets, like which wax is the best wax to use and what color wax to use and all of that. Yeah, I think we're going to have to wait for Caroline to answer that question for us. And yeah, I wait with bated breath. Maybe a couple weeks from now when I see her, she will be able to illuminate, you know, that one. It's really difficult. This is another thing that's really difficult to deal with, though, because you sort of think, well, we'll scrape the top of this tablet and we'll get a little wax and we'll put it in a mass spectrometer or something sciencey that I've heard of by mistake over many years and know what's going on. But of course, we don't want to do anything destructive to any of the tablets, right? So we can't just crush one up and do something with it. So yeah, so the scientists, especially at the British Museum, have been really working to figure out how to learn this stuff without doing any harm to the artifacts that are in their care.
Yeah, definitely. This is a kind of maybe a hopeful question, but can you reveal anything about the most recent tablets discovered, transcribed? Unfortunately, no. I just thought I would let you say that as well as me saying that.
I would love to.
Yes.
It takes all my self-control not to talk about it, but yeah, I mean, yeah, interesting stuff in there.
Yeah. I wonder if you use, I'll read this out. I wonder if you use singular or plural in Latin as reflected in other languages is coming out here in the Vindolanda tablets. The use of imperative orders plus different uses of use to a slave is of particular interest. I'm really interested in this polite, impolite, respect, family, or familiar. Would love to know more.
Yeah. So, right. So you're thinking about like Spanish where we have French, like different pronouns, even Italian, right? We have even Italian, especially Italian, because that's the best language in the world. Love it. Right. Yes. Right. Yeah. Or the royal we, for example. You certainly get the royal we. That is very common. And there is let me see. Yeah, there is subtext to pronouns in various ways. I mean, the ones that come to mind are like ille and iste, both of which mean that, but like that, the demonstrative pronoun that. But one means that, and one means that. You know, like iste is like yuck, I don't like that, as opposed to I don't like that. And so there is nuance to this stuff for sure. As far as like the second person pronouns, though, in that case, using a wos instead of a te, I'm not aware of a great distinction that we can make between the two. In that one isn't, you know, when you're being respectful, you would use wos, and when you're just talking to somebody, you use te. So I don't think so there, but it would be a very interesting word study to do, right? You'd have a ton of evidence to think about. We could, you know, if we were just in my office hours, I would just go over there and grab my Oxford Latin Dictionary and start reading. But I'm perfectly aware also that there are going to be pages and pages about both of those words. So it would take a lot. Yeah, I think my short answer is not really.
I think one of the things that I'm always amazed, because I'm not a Latin epigrapher by a long shot, is just how they do just look like scribbles, and the amount of work that you and our other colleagues go through in order to work out one single word, and it is a painstaking sort of process. It's no finger spaces, no kind of common dictionary from what I can tell. No punctuation, any of those types of things aren't there. So it takes a lot to actually get through them.
It's almost as hard as reading my handwriting.
Almost.
One thing, if people are interested in that, or Barb, if you're interested in that and you haven't read it yet, in Roger Tomlin and Alan Bowman's article from 2005, which is, it's in a little edited volume someplace. I have a PDF of it though. It has a really nice discussion of how they go through the process. Right. And basically, yeah, it's like, you know, you work from what you know to what you don't know. Right. So, okay, there's a double S here. What words have double S's in them? If it's this word, then maybe, you know, that's an M that's 3 letters ahead of it. And yeah, it takes a long time and a lot of patience. And yeah, I find I can only do it for about half an hour at a time, and then I have to go for a walk.
Yeah, understandable. We've just got the last couple of questions here. What are your thoughts on the levels of literacy in the Roman world?
Oh, interesting one. Okay, so the textbooks will tell you, right, that, I mean, and you'll get very different answers. Something between like 5 and 30%, something like that. I've read articles recently that were a little bit higher than that. I think that that's a really important thing that Vindolanda is actually helping us to understand. You're going to find that one will find, generally speaking, that this is going to vary greatly on location, right? So big cities, people probably have more need to read and to write than out in the countryside, right? Where they're not having to record business and not seeing texts particularly often. And there's also within this a variability of what we mean by literacy, right? So I made the distinction earlier between literate and literary, right? That means can you write a note that says, I owe you 10 sesterces, or can you write a sonnet, right? I'm not sure. You give me a week, I could write you a sonnet, right? But so we have this like great high level of literacy where we read books, and some of us don't even subvocalize when we read. We just like buzz right through it. And other people struggle more, right? Or don't have as much exposure. So we have to deal with that problem as well. That said, I tend to fall in the high spectrum of literacy. And I'd like to say like a quarter or a third of people maybe could read, at least in the places that I think about.
Okay.
Right. So thinking about the army and relatively urban environments.
Was permanent damage done to the first tablets discovered by them not being handled as they are now? As in, was anything lost, or was it just made more challenging to see?
Okay, so you mean like once Robin recognized what he had?
I believe so. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And as far as I know, no. I think we have as much of that tablet as we've ever had.
Yes.
Mhm.
And I can say that it was very, very quick that and that's part of the reason why we have an on-site laboratory that handles the tablets, is so they are put into chemical quite quickly so that the conservation process can happen. But those very first tablets, we still have a very good image of them and shows how good they originally were. Those are housed down in the British Museum, and you know, I don't believe we've lost anything off of the socks and underpants letter, or anything like that. So
Yeah. That said, you still have to be very careful with them, even like.
well,
So
yeah, they're very fragile.
so one of the like related thing that always disturbs me is to think in how many places there have been these writing tablets and they weren't recognized, right? And maybe they still aren't. And within that, just like how smart Robin was to, and you could never fault Robin for self-confidence, but that he was like, nope, this is writing. We're getting in a car and we're driving to Durham. And just for seeing that, like, it's just incredible. And
Yeah.
nobody had ever seen them before. We knew that they existed. They're referred to in like Herodian, but nobody had ever found one before.
Yeah.
So like, God bless him. Like, great. And if he missed a couple in the fall of 1972, it's like I'm 100% willing to forgive him for that,
Yeah.
for the discovery that he ultimately made in 73.
And I want to just say thank you so much, Alex, for that fantastic talk about the writing tablets and kind of bringing together the history, some of the more recent research, and kind of challenging some of our thoughts that we might have about the Roman Empire, and the information that these tablets can bring to light. So I think that's been a fabulous kind of rethinking for us about the tablets themselves.